So I'm going to start off and tell you guys a little bit of a story here. So when I was 14, I decided that I wanted to become a professional video game player. Anybody here, raise a show of hands, ever heard of the game called Counter-Strike?
Oh, yes.
All right, well, I don't know if any of you know this, but there's actually a very large professional, what they call e-gaming community. And I mean, they're competing for hundreds of thousands of dollars in these tournaments. And I decided that's what I wanted to do. So I had played and I had gotten myself to a level where I was pretty much good enough to do this when I was around 16. And I decided I was going to tell my parents, this is what I want to do. Well, they didn't quite agree with that idea so much. And I planned it out. I said this is what shows, gaming can be a sport. This is if I'm able to get to that level, this is where I can make money and I'm enjoying what I'm doing. And I threw all my reasons out there, but they didn't quite agree with that. And it was more of the lines of my mother said, "You want to do what?" That is kind of the essence of what Covey is talking about in this chapter. It's all about seeking first to understand, then be understood. Corey, Go ahead.
Okay, so this is habit 5, seek first to understand, and then to be understood, as he just said. It actually starts off with the story of a patient going to an optometrist. And he goes in there, and he has a problem with his eyes, and he asks the doctor, to help him out. And the doctor says, well, here. He grabs he takes off his glasses and says, put these on. And the patient puts them on, and he says, I can't see anything. And the doctor says, why not? These worked for me for 20 years. How come they're not working for you? Try harder. Try harder to look at them. And the patient's looking through him, and he said, I can't see. So that's basically a rundown of empathetic listening. The doctor really didn't take the time to diagnose before he prescribed. So how much confidence would you have in a doctor who didn't diagnose before they prescribed? Would you go back to him?
No.
Okay. So how often do we diagnose before we prescribe in communication? A lot of us have a tendency to rush in and try to fix things up with good advice, based on past experiences, and we don't take the time for us to diagnose and to really deeply understand the problem first and where the person's coming from. So according to Covey, the single most important principle that he's learned in the field of interpersonal relations is to seek first and understand, and then to be understood. The principle is the key to effective interpersonal communications. Character and communication. So this is basically, how often do we learn? Communication can be reading, writing, listening, speaking, but how often do we really take the time to, listen empathetically? We are all taught to read, and write and speak, but truly listening is another form. And he goes on to say the majority of listening we have been trained for is based on personality ethic rather than the character technique or character ethic. And it's basically totally opposed to establishing relationships needed to establish authentic relationships. If you want to absolutely interact effectively with someone, it is imperative that you have to understand them. The goal is to make that person comfortable enough and safe enough to open up to you. Ways to do this is just by being yourself, kind of just squashing your ego and just being who you are, not what you want others to be, not how you think others see you, but just being truly you and opening up to them in alignment with who you are. And people can actually feel this and naturally confide in you. But unless you're influenced by my uniqueness, I'm not going to be influenced by your advice. So, to be effective in the habit of interpersonal communications, you have to build that empathetic listening. Now, most people do not listen with the intent to be understood. They listen with the intent to reply. They're automatically coming up and preparing responses for that person. So it's, all right, I'm just going to basically say it. I'm not going to read this. So basically, empathetic listening is just looking at the person, understanding where they're coming from, seeing it from their viewpoint, and really giving and just not really giving advice until you feel that they told you everything. Now, there's 4 levels of listening that we mostly do. We ignore, and basically, we're texting or something, and we're not listening, or we pretend that we're listening, saying like, yeah, okay, yeah. We do selective listening. We can do that with like infants or toddlers. They're talking, and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, and we just listen to key points and go on there. Or we can do attentive listening, but none of these are empathetic listening. It's not referring to the active and reflective listening in these techniques, because the intent to reply or control the manipulator is still there. So, empathetic listening is the listening with the intent to understand. So it's an entirely different paradigm to try to stand in someone else's shoes and to see the world where they're looking. So what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? Does anybody know here? Does anybody have an idea? Okay, well, sympathy is more or less a form of agreement. It's a form of judgment, and it can sometimes it can be inappropriate, but it can also get a person dependent on you for sympathy. So the essence of empathetic listening is not to agree, but to deeply and fully understand the person emotionally as well as intellectually. In fact, according to Covey, experts estimate that only 10% of our communication is represented by the words we say. Another 30% is represented by sounds, and the other 60% is represented by body language. So in this type of listening, it is important to understand with not just with your eyes and ears, but also your heart. This is the key to also making emotional bank deposits. So I encourage you to listen sincerely and empathetically. Real quickly, we listen for autobiographical responses. We tend to evaluate. We either agree or disagree. We tend to probe, just ask them questions. Or we advise, we give counsel, based on what we've been through. Or we interpret. We try to figure them out and try to figure out their motives and etc. And all this kind of just repels the speaker. They're not going to want to open up to you as much. So if you really want to establish long-lasting relationships in the business world, just personal relationships, it's key to listen openly. And also, this is the first step in the process of win-win. So as they just went over the win-win, if you just listen empathetically, you'll get it every time. And I just want to say one story as well, personal story. It was about a few Christmases ago, and I had a girlfriend, and I just started dating her, and she told me that she didn't want anything for Christmas. And, I didn't really try to delve in deeper, and I'm like, you don't want anything for Christmas? Are you sure? I can get you something for Christmas. And she's like, I don't want anything for Christmas. And I'm like, all right. So Christmas Eve rolls along, and I didn't get her anything. And my dad's like, what'd you get her? And I'm like, I didn't get her anything. What are you talking? She didn't want anything. And he said, girls say that, but when you really want something, you got to read between the lines. So the only place I was open was CVS, and I ended up getting her like a curling iron and a bunch of other stuff. But it's just the point that there's still presents there, and everybody wants a gift for Christmas, whether they say it or not. But at that point, I didn't put two together, and that's probably why I'm single right now. But it's all good. I got habit 5 down. Go ahead.
All right, so how do we tie it all together? That's the question here. As Corey said, this part of the habit is it's equally important to the win-win situations that we described earlier. It's, Covey's expressing to the reader a sense of tying in the idea of seeking first to understand and then be understood. And he goes about this in 2 ways. Now, the first half, Covey talks about that it takes consideration. You have to have consideration to really understand what it means to effectively listen to somebody. The second, he explains, is about courage. You have to have the courage to seek to be understood. You have to be able to go after it. This is the ammunition of what Habit 5 is all about. It comes in the form of creating an effective presentation. Now, Covey relies on 3 things. He relies on ethos, pathos, and logos. How many of you have heard of those before? Are you familiar with them? How many of you have actually effectively used them? Probably not many. Now, the first is ethos. It's the emotional investment. So, that chunk that you're going to put in that emotional bank account. The presentation, if you're going to use this, should be expressive. He explains that it should have personal credibility of the speaker. You wouldn't really want to listen to me if I didn't give you, personal credibility and made you think that, what I was saying was worth listening to. A great description of ethos, Covey says, is the trust you inspire. It's your emotional bank account. That connected with me very, very well. That's where the emotional connection lies. Now, next is pathos. Pathos is the empathetic side of communicating, where one truly connects with the feeling of whatever is being communicated. And that's when you invest that chunk, that emotional chunk. That's when you invest that in the account. It's when you go into the pathos side. It's where you invest into what the other person is communicating. When you're listening, can you empathize with that person? Lastly is logos, which, self-explanatory, is the logical side, the reasoning behind what you're going to talk about. Now, he goes into explaining how most people just go straight to logos. I would, in a situation, a lot of times I'll just be like, look, this is why it needs to happen. This is the logical reasons why. Is that effective? Not really. Covey says that this is really damaging unless you precede it by ethos and pathos. And a good example of this is he mentions that they, talking about a guy who couldn't understand also, why his employers weren't understanding, or why his employees weren't understanding his presentations. And, Covey says, who do they send back to school when the salesman doesn't sell? The buyer? No. I mean, obviously, if you're not getting an effective presentation across, it's your job to go back and figure out, what am I doing wrong? And this is what, seeking to be understood is all about. It's all about getting into someone else's frame of reference. Can you put yourself in their shoes? Understand from every aspect better than they can where they're coming from. And in these situations, it's typical that you'll learn along the way. And, your frame of reference might even change. You might actually change what your reasoning, what your logic was, what your outcome would be based on what you had learned. Now, Covey talks about a circle of influence, and Habit 5 is central. It is the center part of the circle of influence. Once you understand somebody, and then you can seek to be understood, and you have these techniques down, your circle begins to expand, as Covey puts it. You are allowing yourself to be influenced, and Covey says this is the single-handedly most important key to being able to influence someone, is to be influenceable yourself. To touch the soul of another, Covey says, is to walk on holy ground. And I thought that was a great quote. It really made you connect with what he was trying to say. And in conclusion, by deeply understanding one another, and their solutions, their alternatives, the alternatives and solutions will arise to problems in communication. If you're having problems in that, this will give you a solution. And communication between one another, it'll become swift, direct, and efficient, as Covey puts it. And as we progress through this book, we're progressing to that last step. And this step right here is what gets us to synergy. And as I talked to you about earlier, I tried to get my parents to understand why professional gaming was a great idea. And they didn't really imply empathetic listening, and should they have? I don't know. At this point, it's probably not a great idea. But at the time, I felt it was really important, and now I agree with what they said. But at the time, I would have really liked for them to be empathetic and to listen to my heartfelt pleas to become a professional gamer. But to have those keys, to have those tools in your toolbox, that's in the future going to make a big difference. And we just hope that you guys are fully invested in what that represents. So thank you very much.